The golden chains around Musio's neck felt like a noose as he stared at the screen, their polished links mocking the dark, jagged tattoos that crawled up his throat and across his chest. On the phone, the contrast was a visceral punch to his gut. The cold, heavy jewelry of a man who thought he owned the world set against the sickening crimson bloom spreading across Rosa's white hospital gown. The blood was a vibrant, terrifying red, stark against the sterile fabric, signaling a tragedy he had paved the way for with his own arrogance. Welcome to Favy Love Stories. Like and hit the subscribe button now, because there are many more stories like this coming your way. Tune in for more danger, desire, and unforgettable tales. Now let's begin. Only an hour ago, he had been the king of the eclipse, a man of iron and ink who believed that his name alone was a shield for his family. He had sat in the velvet embrace of the VIP lounge, the weight of his gold and the permanence of his tattoos serving as symbols of an empire built on blood and absolute control. When the phone had buzzed with Rosa's name, he hadn't seen a woman in need. He had seen an interruption to his glory. He had slid the device away, face down, choosing the shimmering lights of the penthouse over the dimming light in his wife's eyes. Now, the tattoos that once symbolized his strength felt like stains of guilt. Every line of ink was a reminder of a life lived for himself, while the blood on Rosa's gown was the price of his neglect. As she sat bound in that flickering warehouse light, her gray coat clutched over her swollen belly, the reality of placental abruption was turning her body into a tomb. The medical emergency was a silent predator, born from the stress of the abduction and the physical trauma of her capture. The placenta, the very lifeline for their daughter, was tearing away from the uterine wall, depriving the baby of oxygen and causing the internal hemorrhaging that now stained her clothes. Musio's hands, which had signed off on hits and collected fortunes, shook so violently that the gold on his wrists rattled. He was a man of power who was suddenly, utterly powerless. He looked at the photo again, the gun to her belly, the terror in her eyes, and the blood that shouted the truth he had tried to ignore. He had built a kingdom of sand, and it was washing away in the wake of his own betrayal. He didn't just need to save her from the Constantine syndicate. He needed to save her from the ghost of the man he had been just 60 minutes prior. The air in the Eclipse penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and Sienna's intoxicating perfume, a sharp contrast to the cold, rainy reality Muzio had left behind at the estate. He leaned back into the crimson velvet of the VIP booth, the gold chains around his neck catching the strobe lights like a shimmering collar of power. Muzio felt invincible, the king of a city that bowed to his tattoos and his name. To his left, Sienna laughed, a light, melodic sound that fed his ego as she traced the jagged ink on his forearm. For Muzio, this night was about reclaiming the reckless freedom he felt was being swallowed by the looming shadow of impending fatherhood. In his pocket, the phone vibrated for the 11th time. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The name Rosa had illuminated his pocket every few minutes for the last hour, a persistent annoyance that threatened to tether him back to the responsibilities he was desperate to escape. With a practiced coldness, Muzio pulled the device out just enough to see the notification. 11 missed calls. He felt a flicker of irritation, not concern. In his mind, Rosa was safe in their fortress, likely just wanting him to hear about a nursery color or a phantom kick. He viewed her needs as burdens, small anchors dragging against his status. "Smart man," Sienna whispered, her lips brushing his jaw as she noticed him sliding the phone back into his pocket, face down. "She'll survive one night without you." "She always does." Muzio smirked, a jagged expression of pure hubris. "She's fine. She just wants attention," he replied, his voice a low rumble of dismissal. He believed he was untouchable, that his family was a secondary accessory to the empire he had carved from blood. He ordered another round of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising like his own inflated sense of security. But while Muzio was celebrating his freedom, the silence he had forced upon Rosa was becoming deadly. Miles away, under the flickering lights of their home, Rosa was experiencing the terrifying onset of placental abruption. The trauma of the intrusion and the sheer stress of the moment had caused the placenta to begin detaching from her uterine wall. This condition is a severe pregnancy complication where the placenta peels away from the inner wall of the uterus before delivery, potentially depriving the baby of oxygen and nutrients and causing heavy, life-threatening internal bleeding for the mother. As Muzio toasted to his own health, he was blissfully unaware that every second he spent ignoring the annoyance of her calls, the clock was ticking down on the lives of his wife and child. He was choosing temptation, but in the shadows of the club, someone else was choosing revenge. The king was being watched, and the price of his one night of neglect was already being calculated in blood. The storm outside the estate was a mirror to the rising panic in Rosa's chest. She stood in the dim foyer, her hand trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear for the 12th time, only to be met with the hollow, mocking ring of Muzio's voicemail. Every time his recorded voice boomed, confident, untouchable, dismissive, a fresh wave of agony rolled through her abdomen. This wasn't the rhythmic tightening of Braxton Hicks. This was a sharp, shearing pain that felt like her very foundation was being torn apart. She leaned against the cold marble wall, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Below her ribs, the pressure was immense, a dull ache that suddenly sharpened into a hot, stabbing sensation. She didn't know yet that her body was becoming a battlefield. Inside the sanctuary of her womb, a silent catastrophe was unfolding, placental abruption. In this life-threatening condition, the placenta, the vital organ responsible for delivering oxygen and nutrients to the baby, begins to detach prematurely from the inner wall of the uterus. Whether triggered by the sudden, violent surge of stress hormones as she heard the front door splintering or the physical shock of being shoved, the results were devastating. As the placenta peels away, it creates a pool of blood between itself and the uterine wall, cutting off the baby's lifeline and causing massive internal or external hemorrhaging for the mother. It is a race against a biological clock that has suddenly begun to scream. Rosa felt the warmth of blood staining her thighs, a terrifying contrast to the freezing rain she was pushed into. "Muzio, please!" she whimpered, her voice swallowed by the thunder as a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Her phone fell, the screen shattering against the pavement, but her last thought wasn't of the kidnappers. It was the image of Muzio's face in the dark of the club, a face she knew was turned away from her. As the van sped off, the internal bleeding intensified, the pain radiating through her back, a classic symptom of the abruption. She felt the baby kick once, a frantic, weak movement that felt like a plea for help. Rosa's world began to gray at the edges, the lack of oxygen reaching her own brain mirroring the struggle of life within her. She was drifting into a void of trauma and neglect, a victim of a war she hadn't started and a husband who had decided, for just one night, that she wasn't worth the answer. The interior of the van was a tomb of shadows and the metallic scent of blood. Rosa lay on the floor, her body trembling with the rhythmic, agonizing waves of placental abruption. Every jolt of the vehicle felt like a blade twisting in her womb, a physical manifestation of her world tearing apart. Her captors, silent and spectre-like, watched her not with pity, but with a cold, calculated hunger for the moment her hope would finally extinguish. One of them reached down, roughly pulling her chin up, forcing her blurred vision to focus on a glowing smartphone screen held inches from her face. "Look at your savior, Rosa," the man hissed. The video play button was pressed, and the sound of thumping bass and clinking glass filled the cramped space. It was a high-definition betrayal. There was Muzio, the man she had called 12 times while the breath was being choked out of her, leaning back in a velvet booth at the penthouse. He looked radiant, his gold chains catching the light, his head thrown back in a booming laugh at something Sienna had whispered in his ear. The camera zoomed in on his face, the face of a man who wasn't just occupied, but one who was willfully oblivious, savoring the very freedom that was costing Rosa her life. As the video continued, showing Muzio sliding his phone face down onto the table with a dismissive smirk, Rosa felt a coldness far more lethal than the blood loss. It was the death of her spirit, the physical pain of the abruption, the internal hemorrhaging caused by the placenta detaching, seemed to pale in comparison to the psychological weight of being discarded. She had spent months telling herself she was his partner, his queen, the mother of his legacy. But the video provided the brutal proof she was an annoyance, to be silenced, so he could enjoy his drink. Her eyes, once searching the darkness for the headlights of a rescue team, went dull and vacant. The will to fight, the instinct to hold on for just one more minute, began to slip away with the tide of her own blood. She stopped crying out his name. The silence in the van became absolute, save for the mocking echo of Muzio's laughter playing on a loop. Just as her body was failing her, Muzio's indifference had finally finished the job, breaking the one thing the kidnappers couldn't touch, her belief that she was worth coming home to. He had chosen wrong, and in the flickering light of the phone, Rosa finally accepted that she was dying alone. The tires of Muzio's sedan screamed against the gravel as he skidded to a halt in front of the skeletal remains of the old shipyard warehouse. The air here was thick with the stench of salt and rot, a far cry from the expensive perfumes and filtered air of the penthouse he had so recently occupied. He sprinted toward the entrance, his polished shoes splashing through oily puddles, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The silence of the structure was absolute, heavy with the weight of what had already transpired. He pushed through the heavy steel doors, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, a single, flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows against the concrete pillars. The space was empty, save for a lone metal chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room. Muzio slowed his pace, his breath hitching in his throat. As he approached the chair, his eyes caught a glint of gold on the floor. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached into a dark, viscous puddle that had pooled near the chair's legs. His fingers closed around a familiar band, Rosa's wedding ring. It was cold, slippery with the blood that had seeped from her body as her internal biological clock failed. Holding the ring to the light, he saw the jagged edges of the bloodstain, a silent testament to the placental abruption that was stealing her life and the life of their child. The medical reality of the situation crashed over him with more force than any rival's bullet. Placental abruption is a critical emergency where the placenta separates from the uterus, causing massive internal bleeding and cutting off the infant's oxygen supply. It is often triggered by the extreme physical and emotional trauma Rosa had endured while he was busy ignoring her calls. As he stared at the ring in his blood-stained palm, the crushing weight of his hubris finally broke him. He looked at the empty chair and realized that the annoyance he had dismissed was his entire world. There were no enemies left to curse, no traitors to blame for this specific moment of agony. The shattered screen of the phone he found discarded nearby showed the 12th missed call, a digital tombstone for his own decency. Muzio let out a low, guttural howl that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. He had built an empire of fear and status, but in his pursuit of being untouchable, he had touched the one thing that mattered and let it slip through his fingers. He wasn't just a boss losing a legacy. He was a man realizing he had been his own greatest enemy. Every drop of blood in that puddle was a debt he could never repay, and for the first time in his violent life, Muzio Marino truly understood what it meant to be alone. Muzio's phone vibrated in his blood-stained palm, the screen flickering with a map that displayed 3 pulsing red dots. A voice, distorted and cold, crackled through the speaker. "One chance, Muzio. One location. The others are rigged to blow. Choose where your legacy ends." The first sat over the derelict warehouse district, the logical choice for a mafia execution. It was isolated, easy to defend, and fit the brutal profile of his enemies. The second dot was at the pier, a place of quick escapes and deep waters, where a body could disappear forever. His tactical mind, the one trained in years of cold calculation, screamed at him to head for the docks. But his heart, finally waking from its long, narcissistic slumber, pulled him toward the third, a small, unassuming private clinic on the outskirts of the city. Logic dictated that his rivals would never take her to a medical facility. It was too risky, too public. But Muzio closed his eyes, picturing Rosa. He remembered how she used to hum while folding baby clothes, how she feared the cold and the dark, and how she had pleaded with him to find a doctor who wouldn't look at her like a mobster's property. If she was fighting for her life, she wouldn't be at a dock or a warehouse. She would be reaching for a place of healing. He knew the clock was running out. The internal bleeding from the placental abruption meant that every minute spent driving to the wrong location was a minute closer to Rosa's heart stopping. This condition, where the placenta detaches from the uterus, doesn't just threaten the baby with oxygen deprivation. It puts the mother at risk of disseminated intravascular coagulation, a life-threatening clotting disorder caused by the trauma. She needed a surgical suite, not a concrete floor. "I'm coming to the clinic!" Muzio growled into the phone, slamming the car into gear. "You're a fool, Marino," the voice mocked. "That's the long way. You'll never make it in time." Muzio didn't care about the odds. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking like a boss. He was thinking like a husband. He ignored the tactical maps and the strategic probabilities, steering the car toward the one place where Rosa might feel a sliver of safety amidst the horror. He was no longer playing a game of power. He was following the faint, fading pulse of the woman he had almost lost to his own pride. As the clinic came into view, he saw the guards in the shadows and knew his instinct had been right. Love had whispered where logic had failed, and he would tear through heaven and hell to reach that operating room. The sterile hallway of the clinic was a corridor of chaos as Muzio burst through the rear exit, his arms cradling Rosa's limp body. She was barely conscious, her skin a ghostly shade of porcelain, her breathing shallow and ragged. Behind them, the sounds of heavy boots and the sharp metallic clicks of reloading weapons echoed against the tiled walls. The rival syndicate was closing in, desperate to finish the job Muzio's neglect had started. He could see the ambulance idling at the curb, its red and blue lights pulsing like a heartbeat against the falling rain, but the 30 feet of open pavement between them felt like a mile. As they cleared the doorway, the first crack of gunfire shattered the night. Muzio didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for the handgun tucked into his waistband. Instead, he pivoted his massive frame, using his own body as a living shield for the woman and the unborn child he had so nearly forsaken. A sharp, searing heat tore through his left shoulder, the impact of a bullet spinning him momentarily, but he didn't let go. He tightened his grip on Rosa, his blood beginning to mingle with hers, dripping onto the asphalt as he forced his legs to move. The physical trauma of the move was a secondary concern to the ticking clock of the placental abruption. Every second they remained outside was a second the baby went without sufficient oxygen. In a placental abruption, the mother is at extreme risk of hemorrhagic shock, a condition where the body's blood volume drops so low that the heart cannot pump enough blood to the organs. Muzio felt the warmth of his own wound spreading down his back, but all he could think of was the coldness of Rosa's hands. "Stay with me," he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice a raw plea. "I'm here now. I'm not leaving." He reached the back of the ambulance, just as another round whizzed past his ear, embedding itself in the vehicle's frame. He shoved Rosa into the waiting hands of the paramedics, his injured arm screaming in protest. As the doors began to swing shut, Muzio collapsed against the bumper, his gold chain splattered with the red cost of his redemption. He watched the light in Rosa's eyes flicker as the oxygen mask was pressed to her face. He had taken a bullet for her life, a small installment on the massive debt of love he owed. As the siren wailed and the vehicle sped away, Muzio stayed in the rain, a fallen king finally understanding that true power wasn't in who you could kill, but in who you were willing to die for. The smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the neonatal intensive care unit replaced the echoes of gunfire and the pulse of the nightclub. Muzio sat by the incubator, his shoulder bandaged and stiff, his eyes never leaving the tiny, fragile life inside. Their daughter, Hope, was a miracle of modern medicine, born via emergency C-section after the trauma of the abruption. She looked impossibly small, surrounded by wires and tubes that monitored her every breath, a stark reminder of how close Muzio's negligence had come to extinguishing his future before it even began. The lead nurse approached him, her voice a soft contrast to the clinical beeps of the monitors. She didn't see a mafia boss or a man of power, she saw a father who was drowning in guilt. She gently suggested they begin Kangaroo Care, a term Muzio didn't understand until she guided his shaking, tattooed hands to lift the tiny infant and place her directly against his bare chest. As Hope's skin touched him, the world outside the hospital walls ceased to exist. For premature babies, this skin-to-skin contact is not just a gesture of affection, it is a vital medical intervention. Known as Kangaroo Care, it helps stabilize the infant's heart rate, improves breathing patterns, and regulates body temperature more effectively than an incubator alone. For the parent, the contact triggers the release of oxytocin, the love hormone, which is essential for emotional bonding and reducing the psychological trauma of a high-stress birth. Muzio felt the frantic, bird-like flutter of Hope's heart against his own. As her breathing began to synchronize with his, The icy wall he had built around his heart for decades finally shattered. He wasn't thinking about his territory, his rivals, or his status. He was focused on the warmth of a small life he was now literally keeping stable with his own body. In the quiet of the NICU, the man who had always demanded respect realized that the only thing worth having was the trust of this helpless child. He whispered a silent vow into the crown of her head, promising that from this moment on, he would be the shield he had failed to be for her mother. The ink on his skin had always told stories of his past, but the warmth of his daughter against his chest was the first page of a new story, one defined by presence, not power. The transition of power happened in a dimly lit office that smelled of expensive leather and old regrets, a place that had once been Muzio's inner sanctum. Luca, his most loyal lieutenant, sat across from him, his eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion and ambition. On the mahogany desk between them lay the ledgers, the encrypted drives, and the heavy signet ring that had symbolized the Marino family's iron grip on the city for 3 generations. For years, Muzio had believed these items were the summit of a man's existence, the power that made him untouchable. Now, they looked like a pile of rusted scrap metal. "You're walking away from everything, Muzio," Luca said, his voice low. "The territory, the respect, the fear. You spent 20 years building this throne. You're just going to burn it." Muzio looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at his hands that had finally been washed off the blood of his enemies only to be stained by the tears of his wife. He thought of the sterile silence of the NICU and the way Rosa had looked at him through her oxygen mask, not with fear, but with a hollow, haunting disappointment that no amount of money could fix. "I didn't build a throne, Luca. I built a distraction," Muzio replied, his voice devoid of its usual gravelly edge. "I spent my life making sure everyone knew my name, while the only person who actually needed to hear it was calling me 12 times in the dark. Power is easy. You just have to be willing to be a monster. But presence, being there when the world is falling apart, that's the only empire that doesn't crumble." He pushed the ledgers toward Luca. By handing over the keys to his kingdom, Muzio was liquidating a life of violence to fund a life of invisibility. He realized that the respect he had demanded from the streets was a phantom, a flickering light compared to the steady, burning necessity of being a father who actually shows up. He wasn't losing his status. He was trading a crown of thorns for the privilege of holding his daughter's hand. As he walked out of the office for the last time, leaving the gold and the greed behind, Muzio didn't feel smaller. For the first time, as the heavy doors closed on his past, he felt like a man who finally understood that his true legacy wasn't written in the ledgers of the Mafia, but in the heartbeat of the family he had nearly destroyed. He was burning the empire to save his soul. The golden light of a Mediterranean morning spilled across the wooden table of the beach house, a far cry from the cold, neon glare of Muzio's former life. There were no bodyguards at the door, no muffled conversations about shipments or hits, only the rhythmic sizzle of batter on a hot griddle and the high-pitched giggles of 18-month-old Hope. Muzio stood at the stove, his large, tattooed hands, once used to strike fear into the hearts of men, now delicately flipping a pancake shaped like a lopsided heart. Rosa sat by the window, the sea breeze catching her hair as she watched him. The silence between them was no longer heavy with the jagged shards of betrayal, but it wasn't yet light. It was a quiet, working peace. Muzio knew that 18 months of showing up hadn't erased the 12 missed calls or the image of her bound in that warehouse, but he also knew that trust wasn't rebuilt with a single grand gesture or a suitcase full of blood money. It was rebuilt in the mundane, in the boring consistency of being the first one awake to make breakfast and the last one to check the locks at night. He plated the pancakes and sat down, his gaze shifting from the scars on his shoulder to the vibrant, healthy glow in Hope's cheeks. He realized then that emotional neglect wasn't just a mistake of a single night. It was a slow erosion of a partner's soul. Healing it required the opposite, a slow, intentional reconstruction of safety. In the psychological recovery following a trauma-induced birth and maternal abandonment, the consistency principle is vital. For a partner to heal from the deep wounds of neglect, the offending party must demonstrate reliable, predictable behavior over a long period. This showing up isn't just physical presence, it is emotional attunement, recognizing the unspoken fears and meeting them with steady, unwavering support. This process allows the brain's amygdala, which has been conditioned to expect danger and abandonment, to slowly relax and accept the presence of love as a new constant. "Dada mess," Hope chirped, pointing at a smear of syrup on her chin. Muzio laughed, a sound that was once rare but was now the soundtrack of his days. He reached out with a napkin, gently cleaning her face, his eyes meeting Rosa's over their daughter's head. She gave him a small, genuine smile, a tiny bridge built over a vast canyon of past pain. Muzio realized that his old empire had been a prison of his own making, a fortress of ego that kept him from the only thing that mattered. His new empire was here, in this kitchen, measured not in territory or power, but in the sticky fingers of his child and the quiet grace of a wife who was learning to trust him again. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that real love isn't a feeling you have, but a choice you make every single morning. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support means the world to us. If this story touched your heart, imagine what's coming next. More passion, more twists, and more unforgettable moments await you. Don't forget to hit the like button. Keep watching for more captivating stories that will leave you breathless. See you in the next tale.